What's up guys, my name is Jake and welcome to Abandoned, episode 52, and this is a very special episode. Today I wanted to talk about something I've been making videos on for a while, a place which inspired me to even start this series. I made an episode on it way back in 2015, but so much has happened since and there's so much more that I never got a chance to talk about. So today, let's revisit Walt Disney World's first water park and one of the most iconic abandoned theme park locations in the world, River Country. This episode is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Go to surfshark.deals/BSF to get 85% off and 3 extra months for free. It all began in 1973 with the worldwide oil crisis. Walt Disney World had just opened 2 years prior, and the resort was facing the issue of low attendance due to this economic depression. So the company began looking into building new, yet smaller attractions outside of the Magic Kingdom. After building Treasure Island out on Bay Lake in 1974, that separate ticket attraction proved to be quite popular. So the company began planning for a water-based attraction unlike any other. Of course, because this was Central Florida, any water park would work, but River Country was really quite unique. Unlike other water parks in the country that were just standard, gray concrete, prefabricated slides, this custom water park was going to be fully themed, having guests enter the loosely fictional world of Tom Sawyer. The site selected was the northern corner of the Fort Wilderness campground, on land which was previously just horse pastures. Fort Wilderness already had a train running through it, making it perfect for transferring guests to the new water park, and it was going to help boost the appeal of the campground to new visitors. So construction began, and on June 20th, 1976, River Country had opened to the public with President Ford's daughter taking the first slide. It was one of, if not the world's first, fully themed water park. Immediately, the new attraction was a hit with guests, being one of the most unique water park experiences ever created. The layout of River Country was also unique, as a major portion of the 5-acre park had water fed directly from Bay Lake into it. The water in that main bay area, called the Old Swimming Hole, was made to look like it was just an extension of the lake, but in reality, it was using a confluent water filtering system. To prevent flooding when the natural lake's water level changed, the park's old swimming hole was raised a few inches higher, bordered by a retaining wall next to the Bay Bridge. Water from Bay Lake was pumped into the massive artificial mountain, filtered, then pumped down into the swimming hole via the water slides, constantly ensuring the water wasn't stagnant and always filtered. This created a unique sand-bottom swimming area to which several themed water slides would conclude. Most notably out of the slides was the Whitewater Rapids, which essentially was a fast-paced, lazy river down a 330-foot winding path of sudden drops. There was also structures out in the bay to swing and zip line off of, as well as a kiddie area off to the side. River Country also featured a chlorinated regular pool with a slide only able to exist from the 1970s. To cap off your River Country experience, the park had a secluded nature trail perched above a swamp and a volleyball court placed out in the actual lake. All in all, River Country was the ideal family water park at the time, and quickly grew in popularity. Over the next few years, millions of people had visited the park, mainly with a positive experience filled with cherished memories. But as time went by, the flaws of River Country began to become more apparent, mainly in its size. The park was only around 5 acres large and could hold just 4,700 guests per day. Capacity became a huge problem as popularity grew, since the small River Country Park was the only water park experience in Walt Disney World, and one of very few in the area. As the resort in a whole greatly expanded in the 1980s, that just meant more people were visiting, millions more. The water park built in the 1970s was just too small to handle the huge influx of guests wanting to visit a Disney water park. So Disney began construction on something to help alleviate this need, a brand new water park called Typhoon Lagoon. This enormous 56-acre park absolutely dwarfed River Country when it opened in 1989.
Typhoon Lagoon is our answer to River Country because River Country was getting so full. River Country in the 70s, when it opened, was revolutionary for its time. It was the first themed water park around. In fact, we've compared it to what Disneyland was in 1955 to other amusement parks. It became extremely popular, and we just decided to build another one bigger and better.
It was a turning point for the resort, making Typhoon Lagoon the must-do attraction for all of Walt Disney World, and River Country, a good spot if you're visiting or staying in Fort Wilderness. By the early 1990s, things got even worse for the park. Disney had opened yet another massive water park called Blizzard Beach in April of 1995. Disney had also banned all people from swimming in their lakes by this time, and despite River Country's water being filtered, this wasn't a good sign for the future. Disney had then raised River Country's admission price, which most guests didn't see as much value since there were bigger and better places to visit. Since the majority of the park's water came from the lake, it wasn't heated, which meant on slightly cooler days, the park would just shut down entirely. River Country also hadn't really been updated at all, and now in a new world of guest expectations, the 1970s water park design wasn't exactly cutting it. By the late 1990s, attendance to the park was obviously down. While River Country had its dedicated fan base for those who loved the hometown and nature-oriented feel of the park compared to the newer facilities, the fact was that River Country likely didn't have much of a bright future. By fall of 2001, the park had shut down as it did every year for the winter season. However, by April of 2002, the Orlando Sentinel posted an article claiming that River Country may not reopen at all. A Disney spokesperson was asked to comment and said that the park may open if, quote, there's enough guest demand. However, 2 months later, another spokesperson updated the Sentinel, saying the park would remain closed at least through 2002. From satellite photos, we can see that the park was kept up during this time, all the way up until around 2003 with the pool still chlorinated. However, as that year came and went, there was no word about what would happen to the park. The entrance still read River Country, yet photos from this time showed the dormant park very slowly showing signs of neglect. Finally, a fence was put up bordering the property, and by 2005, Disney had officially announced that River Country was not going to reopen. By that time, the park was already in disrepair. Photos taken during this time showed the upstream plunge pool drained with mildew growing on the sides. The amazing rockwork had already begun chipping away, and the old swimming hole was now turning into a swamp, with grass growing out of the beach area, and without filtration, the sitting water turned green with algae growing on top. For a while, the entire park had been cut off by fences to the rest of Fort Wilderness. Though in 2008, because Mickey's Backyard Barbecue was now open, the dining pavilion where that took place was essentially inside the water park. So instead of a fence blocking the entire property, now Disney erected a fence bordering the pool area, allowing guests to freely walk inside what was formerly the paths and buildings to River Country. Snack stands were still standing, as well as signs obviously pointing out that the land was something else. Over the next few years, Disney didn't make any public statements on the now abandoned water park. A few buildings were demolished and the park's water tower was relocated to the pool in Fort Wilderness. River Country, however, continued to rot away in the Florida sun. The once crowded watering hole, inspired by nature, was now being taken over by nature. And because of its abrupt decision to close, much of the park was left stuck in time. Music was even still playing as if River Country had been wrapping up for the day. Incredibly, even the lights remained on inside the park, illuminating as dusk fell. As far back as 1994, plans called for redevelopment of River Country. River Country was more or less the same as it was when it first opened. However, when Disney contracted the Urban Design Group to build a wilderness-themed lodge on Bay Lake, their master plan also included Fort Wilderness. The plan was to build a moderate resort on the shores of Fort Wilderness directly beside River Country. And this is where things get interesting. The hotel was named Disney's Buffalo Junction, but it also went by Disney's Settlement Junction. This resort was made to resemble an old Western-style town. Comprised of 600 rooms, guests would check in at Wilderness Lodge, then take a train to the Junction. Now, this resort was to be placed right on top of Pioneer Hall, meaning it would be directly adjacent to the existing River Country Park. But in the site plans, in the green space next to the bathroom area overlapping the barbecue pavilion, sits something called Country Fair. This almost appears to be an expansion to River Country. While it's hard to make out what exactly these objects are in the general master plan schematics, it could be assumed that they would be small flat rides, a green space park, or even modern water slides. It appears this site would in some way connect to River Country and even leave room for future expansion. There's even evidence to suggest that in this new hotel plan, River Country was going to be rebranded with a new name to be part of Buffalo Junction. In the Urban Design Group's book, this is a line when describing the hotel. Quote, "A standalone dance hall and Longhorn Steak restaurant animate Front Street and provide a gateway to River Park, a water theme park." Suffice to say, this might have meant that if Buffalo Junction was built, River Country likely would have gotten an expansion along with acting as the pool area for the new resort. And if so, I think it's very likely that River Country would still be active today. Back to reality though, River Country continued to be left abandoned. In around 2011 though, Disney began working on something to replace the former water park. This was designated to be a pretty large hotel and Disney Vacation Club resort, planned to be directly on top of River Country. While this hotel wasn't terribly unique, it did have a few interesting features like a boathouse and a winding water feature into a lazy river. The main pool also called for several theming elements to nod back to the River Country Park. This resort was pretty far along development, with the architectural firm even creating a visualization of the timeline and how construction would take place. Construction was proposed to have been started in early 2011 with the demolition of River Country, and by late 2013, a finished hotel. This of course never happened though, and River Country remained abandoned. Over the next few years, some areas were demolished, yet the majority was still left to the elements, and by 2014, guests began to get a little curious as the word got out that River Country was abandoned. I know I did, as I made several videos documenting the yearly progression of decay. Disney was still silent on the park though, only publicly acknowledging the area as backstage, yet still allowing guests to walk right up to the fence for some reason. Over the next few years, the park's condition got even worse, a staggering difference from the once clean and operating attraction. In 2017, Disney had actually filled in the main pool with sand. This was likely an attempt to deter mosquitoes from breeding in the still, algae-filled water, as this was the time when the Zika virus was quite a concern. But still, this was the only update to the park, and River Country was left standing. A year later in 2018, permits were filed by Disney to perform site boring tests around the River Country property. These are usually done to test if the ground is suitable for construction, and with an apparent positive result, finally by October of 2018, 17 years after River Country had closed and was left abandoned, Disney had announced a brand new 900-room hotel and DVC resort. It's called Reflections, a Disney Lakeside Lodge, and is, quote, a classic country lodge reimagined. The resort is pretty modern, with earthy design cues and large open spaces. It also heavily features Disney characters, and will have both A-frame villas and treehouse suites that the majority of guests will never be able to afford. Some concept art also alludes to there being structures on the water, which may be houseboats? The resort will also feature a bayou-style restaurant in the former place of the nature trails at River Country. Reflections as a whole is a modern take on the beautiful and detailed craftsman work of the Wilderness Lodge, one that has many sharp edges and neutral colors, but also very generic with Disney character statues thrown in for some reason. To me, it looks like a Whole Foods as a hotel, but objectively luxurious, as the developer behind the project is well experienced in building premium properties. My only gripe is that it doesn't belong where it is. All in all, the resort's footprint is massive, completely replacing River Country and then some. So finally, in March of 2019, after so long, the abandoned, now almost unrecognizable water park was being dismantled. It appears some sections of the park were saved, however the majority of the abandoned facility was completely destroyed. Once demolition was completed, the land grading began. First with filling in the old swimming hole, then clearing out land, digging a retention pond, and everything else that comes with essentially building on top of a swamp. And that brings us to now, with Disney starting major construction on the resort, one with an opening date of 2022. However, with the pandemic situation, it may be delayed as long as another year. However, from what I understand, hotels are already funded before work begins, so there's no turning back now. But all of this still leaves the question, why did River Country close in the first place, and why did it take them so long to demolish it? Well, it was honestly a bit of a perfect storm of issues, all coinciding until Fort Wilderness decided to close it permanently. The park, remember, was over 25 years old, and with it being one from the mid-1970s, of course there are going to be elements that were built for the era it was in. Because it was built at a time when attendance was much smaller than it is now, the park was constructed to meet the need of the time, and give Fort Wilderness a boost, while also packaging it with Discovery Island. Safety was also a bit of a concern, as lifeguard placements were a bit far to watch over everyone. This resulted in the drowning of a 14-year-old boy in 1982. On that point, there's actually been a pretty famous urban legend that Disney closed the park due to a deadly brain-eating bacteria in the water. This is sort of true, as in 1980, an 11-year-old boy died after swimming in river country. This brain-eating amoeba is called Naegleria flori, and can be found in warm bodies of water across the world. There really wasn't and still isn't a treatment for such a case, mostly because contracting it is extremely rare, and only happens typically in lakes, which half of river country essentially was. And by rare, I mean only 145 people have ever contracted it in the United States. This was, after all, the 1980s, and since no blame was put on Disney, the park continued to operate as it did. But later on, as the state of Florida introduced new swimming filtration laws, the tourism crash of 9/11, and other reasons I mentioned earlier, the park was likely just too expensive and too convoluted to keep operating. Especially with its pairing of Discovery Island now closed, and the new water parks taking in all the spotlight. River Country was now just for people who were fans of it and guests at Fort Wilderness. But then there's the mystery of why it sat abandoned for so long. Well, actually, I think I can explain that too. From what I understand, each resort is allocated funding from Disney Parks and Resorts every quarter or so. It's like a chain coming right down from the corporate side, and each property in Walt Disney World gets their own budget and more or less on how to spend it. Fort Wilderness and their management was in charge of River Country. My theory is that after the company made the decision not to reopen the park after 2003 or so, Fort Wilderness didn't want to spend their budget to demolish it. From what I've heard as well, the large fake mountains with pumps inside had copious amounts of asbestos, and demolishing it as well as trekking heavy machinery through a swamp would cost a lot. Millions of dollars at least. Perhaps way more than the resort could afford to tackle at the time, which, by the way, was a time when funding to the park division was down, and I can only imagine how little the campground was allocated. Later on, when the DVC resort was announced, that too was going to be a part of Fort Wilderness. But since members who are at the demographic of a timeshare hotel don't really stay at campgrounds, the project was likely thought to not have the customer base. From what I understand though, the Reflections Resort won't be officially part of Fort Wilderness, and thought of more as a standalone hotel in extreme close proximity to the campground. Plus, in between these two hotel projects, River Country was likely just caught up in limbo, waiting for someone to pull the trigger to demolish the park when funding for a hotel was ready. And that sort of wraps everything up. In my opinion, River Country was a great and innovative water park at the time, but that's the problem. The time. Disney, and really even the world, outgrew the park, and you can't blame them for that. After all, it was the mid-1970s, and that's what was popular then. But that fact ultimately killed the park once expectations and regulations grew as eras passed. By the early 2000s, the park from 25 years prior was just too much of a liability rather than an asset. But as it sat abandoned and decaying for almost 2 decades, it became sort of a symbol or an icon of classic Disney, but one that was distorted and forgotten. It was sad for some and extremely fascinating for others like me, a place that fueled my interest in abandoned places and is pretty much the reason why this show exists. It's like looking into a weird and fascinating world where a classic Disney park was left to the elements. Finally, after being in limbo for years, it was demolished, and the land will now be home to a luxury resort. Hopefully one which will have some nods in the pool area to the land it's taking. Regardless, the legacy of River Country will always be talked about, and it'll forever be one of, if not the most, iconic abandoned location in theme park history. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of Abandoned, and I want to give a special thanks to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this episode. If you ever find yourself traveling to countries that have certain internet region blocking, using Surfshark can allow you to quickly and seamlessly switch between countries, essentially making those sites think you're in a different area. For instance, if Disney Plus isn't available in your country, or maybe you're trying to watch a show on Netflix that can only be watched in a certain country, then all you need to do is switch your location just like that. Surfshark also comes with a bunch of other security and privacy features to ensure that if you're browsing the web on unsecured sites, or perhaps wanting to keep your data private from ISPs, Surfshark will allow you to be anonymous and secure. Please go use my link surfshark.deals/BSF or use the code BSF to get a really great deal of 85% off and 3 extra months for free. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.